Hey guys, tonight we're taking a quiet trip into the past, back to a time when ordinary things had extraordinary secrets. So settle in, dim the lights, and if you enjoy a story that unravels history's mysteries, why not hit that like and subscribe button? It's always fascinating to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Tonight, we begin with a lump of iron, the most unglamorous hero of human history. From the sharp edge of swords to the soaring arches of cathedrals, from the humble plow to the cold steel of prison bars, iron truly built the medieval world. And somehow, it's still outlasting your lawnmower. If you ever stroll through a medieval cathedral, take a good, close look at the ironwork. The bolts, the hinges, the gates, and the railings. They've been sitting there since the Crusades, surviving rain, plague, candle wax, and every tourist who's touched them for luck. They're dark, sturdy, and smugly intact. Meanwhile, your patio chair is probably decomposing like forgotten fruit because it got rained on twice. The Middle Ages are famous for their ignorance, their filth, and some pretty interesting medical theories that involved leeches. But when it came to metal, those people accidentally invented immortality. Medieval blacksmiths didn't have science, not really. They had fire, intuition, and forearms you could grate cheese on. Their furnaces, called bloomeries, were little clay ovens that ran on charcoal and pure spite. They couldn't reach the temperatures needed to melt iron completely, which sounds like a design flaw, right? But somehow it absolutely wasn't. What came out was a spongy lump, what they called a bloom, full of slag, carbon, and a bit of divine chaos. Today, we definitely call that low quality. Back then, it was just metal that didn't fall apart in the rain. And here's the twist. Those impurities, the very things modern factories would spend millions removing, are the reason medieval iron survived for so long. The slag sealed microscopic cracks, the carbon toughened the surface, and the phosphorus, which every modern metallurgist hates, created a self-healing barrier against rust. In short, their metal was dirty, uneven, and completely invincible. Compare that to your modern steel. It's pure, efficient, and manufactured to rust evenly, like some kind of democratic tragedy. The big difference is that medieval iron wasn't designed by a committee. It was literally beaten into existence by a guy named Edrich, who hadn't slept in 3 days and was probably angry at his cow. As that imperfect iron aged, it developed a dark, glossy skin called patina, which protected it beautifully from moisture. Every scratch just made it stronger, kind of like trauma, but for metal. And because nothing was mass-produced, every single hinge, nail, and chain was forged individually, each with its own quirks. Every strike of the hammer left behind microscopic variations, flaws, character, resilience. So when you see an 800-year-old iron gate outlasting your car's brake lines, remember this. It didn't survive because it was perfect. It survived because it was stubborn, impure, and made by someone who genuinely didn't care about efficiency, just permanence. If medieval metallurgy had a slogan, it would have been, "We don't know why it works, but it does." Blacksmiths of the Middle Ages operated somewhere between engineers and sorcerers. They had no textbooks, no safety codes, and absolutely no concept of quality control. Yet somehow, they produced iron that could outlive empires and probably your warranty. The heart of their operation was the bloomery, a glorified mud chimney stuffed with charcoal, ore, and a whole lot of hope. Inside, air was pumped in by bellows that squealed like dying pigs, creating enough heat to soften iron, but crucially, not melt it. What came out was a lump, a messy, spongy ball called a bloom, halfway between metal and regret. From there, the blacksmith would reheat it and hammer it mercilessly, driving out bits of slag, folding layers, and occasionally cursing loudly enough to qualify as a prayer. The process was brutally slow. If your local ironmonger promised delivery in 3 days, he meant 3 moons and several existential crises. And yet, the imperfection of this method was its magic. The uneven heat, the random carbon content, the traces of silica and phosphorus, all mixed together to form a kind of accidental super metal. Every piece of iron was unique, unpredictable, and weirdly self-preserving. In short, the blacksmith was producing the metallurgical equivalent of sourdough, alive, inconsistent, and practically indestructible. Today's steel is made in sterile factories, measured in decimals, polished to a mirror finish, and designed to fail with dignity. Medieval iron, on the other hand, looked like it had survived the apocalypse before it even left the forge. It was pitted, lumpy, and occasionally hissed when touched by rain, but it absolutely refused to die. It's ironic, isn't it? The medieval forge was a filthy, smoke-choked hole in the ground, and yet it achieved something that our clean, computerized factories can't: longevity. When you compare their chaotic, hand-forged artistry to your mass-produced drill bit, it's like comparing a monk's manuscript to an IKEA instruction sheet. In the modern world, we worship purity, pure steel, pure ingredients, pure intentions. Medieval blacksmiths, on the other hand, worshipped survival. They didn't care about purity. They cared about whether their door hinge would outlast the next plague. And that's why they accidentally created one of history's greatest engineering miracles: slag. Slag was the unwanted byproduct of smelting iron, a gooey mess of silica, charcoal, lime, and whatever else fell into the furnace that week. Most modern metallurgists would call it contamination. Medieval smiths called it Tuesday. Every lump of iron they forged was riddled with these tiny, glassy inclusions, scattered like freckles across its body. And that's what saved it. The slag didn't just sit there, it worked. Those microscopic specks sealed the surface, forming a kind of patchwork armor that blocked oxygen and moisture from sinking in. Essentially, every piece of medieval iron had built-in self-defense, a chemical version of no trespassing. Modern steel, by comparison, is too clean. It's like a bodybuilder who looks amazing, but gets the flu twice a month. We refine, polish, and homogenize everything until there's nothing left to protect it from nature. When your stainless steel sink starts corroding after a few years, that's not bad luck, it's design. But medieval iron was gloriously dirty. The slag acted like nature's epoxy, filling gaps and holding the metal together. Some pieces even developed a glassy outer crust that made them practically immortal. You can still see this on centuries-old gates and swords, a dark, shimmering skin that looks like black marble, that slag doing its job long after its maker turned to dust. The best part: the blacksmiths had no idea why it worked. They thought the ore from certain regions was blessed, or that their forge smoke had mystical properties. They didn't realize they were running one of the most sophisticated corrosion resistance experiments in human history, completely by accident. So yes, medieval iron lasted for centuries because it was full of junk. Modern steel fails because it isn't, which just goes to show: sometimes perfection is overrated, and a little bit of garbage can keep you alive for 800 years. Before the Industrial Revolution and its obsession with efficiency, Medieval blacksmiths had a simpler relationship with technology. Hit it until it works. And if it still doesn't, hit it again but angrier. Their furnaces weren't powered by coal or oil. They ran on charcoal, the original renewable energy source for people who didn't know they were being environmentally friendly. Charcoal was made by slowly burning wood in a low-oxygen pit until it became light, carbon-rich, and ready to ruin a blacksmith's lungs. It was hot enough to soften iron but not melt it, which was a blessing in disguise. See, melting iron would have removed the impurities that made it durable. Instead, the lower heat kept all that glorious trash chemistry locked inside as the iron simmered away in the bloomery. The charcoal infused it with carbon atoms. This process, known today as carburization, transformed the surface into iron carbide, a tough, dark layer that resisted corrosion. To a blacksmith, it just looked like success. He didn't know carbon was bonding with iron. He just knew his blade didn't fall apart when it rained. The best part, charcoal didn't just make the metal stronger. It coated it in soot, sealing it under a natural black patina. That patina didn't flake off like modern paint. It aged like a protective tattoo. You could scratch it, dent it, leave it outside for a century, and it would still look like it had stories to tell. Modern industry replaced charcoal with coke, a faster, hotter, cleaner fuel. It gave us shiny metal that looked great on factory floors and terrible anywhere else. By burning hotter, coke stripped out phosphorus and impurities, the very ingredients that made medieval iron immortal. Charcoal gave medieval metal its soul. Coke gave ours a midlife crisis. The blacksmiths, covered in soot and sweat, unknowingly mastered the first sustainable metallurgy. Slow, imperfect, and stubbornly organic. Every spark from their forges carried carbon, history, and the faint smell of accidental genius. If medieval metallurgy had a patron saint, it would be phosphorus, the element that made iron last for centuries, and ironically, the one modern engineers now treat like a toxic coworker. You'll rarely find a factory bragging, now with 3% more phosphorus. But in the Middle Ages, this impurity was quietly saving the world one hinge at a time. Here's the short version. The ore they used wasn't pure. It came from swampy bog iron deposits or rocky hills loaded with phosphorus. Normally, that would make modern steel too brittle for mass production. But medieval blacksmiths didn't care about mass production. They cared about making one thing that didn't die before winter. When they smelted that phosphorus-rich ore in their bloomeries, something miraculous happened. The phosphorus bonded with the surface of the iron, creating a thin, invisible shield that slowed down corrosion, a natural, self-forming armor. Scientists today call it a phosphate passivation layer. Medieval people called it luck and went back to hitting things with hammers. The magic of phosphorus is that it makes the surface hydrophobic. Water slides off instead of soaking in. Think of it like medieval Teflon, but less convenient and more likely to give you tetanus if handled incorrectly. This microscopic barrier meant their iron didn't rot away in damp cathedrals, even when the walls themselves were sweating. Modern steel, by contrast, is purified within an inch of its life. We remove every trace of phosphorus because it interferes with uniform strength during machining, which is great for manufacturing, but terrible for longevity. We've essentially engineered rust back into our metal in the name of progress. The Vikings and Northern Europeans were especially blessed. Their local ores were naturally high in phosphorus and low in sulfur, an ideal cocktail for indestructible iron. Archaeologists have dug up Viking nails that still gleam faintly after 1,000 years underground. Meanwhile, your garden spade looks like it fought at Hastings and lost. So yes, medieval iron survived because it wasn't perfect. It was fortified by accident. Phosphorus turned impurities into protection, a divine chemistry trick that no one understood, but everyone benefited from. They didn't have science. They had luck, patience, and a touch of swamp magic. And somehow, it worked better than ours. If medieval Europe's ironwork was impressive, India's ancient metallurgy basically rolled up its sleeves and said, "Hold my crucible." Long before Gothic cathedrals or Viking swords, Indian blacksmiths had already achieved something that still confuses modern engineers. A piece of iron that refuses to rust for over 1,600 years. It's called the Delhi Iron Pillar, and it's one of history's most polite middle fingers to corrosion. Erected sometime around the 4th or 5th century CE, this 7-meter-tall monument has stood through monsoons, humidity, pollution, and human curiosity. And it's still shining. Tourists line up to touch it for good luck, unaware they're petting one of the most advanced pieces of pre-industrial technology ever forged. The secret. You guessed it, phosphorus, charcoal, and slow, deliberate craftsmanship. The iron used for the pillar was smelted in small furnaces, then painstakingly welded together layer by layer. Each hammer strike forced out slag and sealed the joints, creating a structure so dense that even air molecules struggle to find a way in. Over time, a compound called mesawate formed on the surface, a mix of iron, oxygen, and phosphorus that acts like a self-healing armor. In other words, it doesn't rust because it's constantly repairing itself, like a superhero made of metal and smugness. Meanwhile, our modern skyscrapers are built with alloys, so pure they practically disintegrate on contact with humidity. The Delhi pillar doesn't even have paint. It doesn't need it. It just sits there, unbothered, watching the centuries pass while nearby car bumpers dissolve within a decade. What's truly poetic is that no one in ancient India knew the chemistry behind it. There was no equation, no scientific theory, just generations of trial, error, and intuition. These smiths weren't chasing perfection, they were chasing permanence. And they caught it. The pillar isn't just metal, it's philosophy hammered into shape, proof that patience and imperfection can outlast everything we call progress. In the modern world, we have machines that can cut metal with lasers. In the medieval world, they had men with hammers. And somehow, the results were better. Every piece of iron in the Middle Ages was shaped by hand, beaten until it begged for mercy, and then beaten some more. It was a relationship built entirely on fire, noise, and questionable workplace safety. Forging was part engineering, part exorcism. The blacksmith would take a bloom, that lumpy, slag-filled chunk of half-cooked metal, heat it until it glowed orange, and then start hammering it into submission. Every strike expelled impurities, condensed the grain, and redistributed the carbon unevenly. To a metallurgist, that sounds sloppy. To the iron, it was therapy. This relentless hammering gave medieval iron a complex internal structure, layers upon layers of slightly different composition. Those variations became microscopic shields, each one slowing down corrosion and cracks. The result wasn't uniform, but it was durable, like a medieval peasant. It survived through sheer stubbornness. Modern steel, in contrast, is too consistent. Machines press and roll it into perfect sheets, smooth and predictable. the metallurgical equivalent of a corporate employee who looks great on paper but breaks under pressure. Medieval iron had character. It was dense in some spots, soft in others, and full of secrets. If it bent gracefully. When it rusted with dignity. The blacksmith's forge was more cathedral than workshop. Sparks flew like prayers, the anvil sang with every strike, and the iron literally breathed, expanding, contracting, becoming alive. Each hammer blow was a heartbeat. The smith wasn't just shaping metal, he was convincing it to exist. And maybe that's why their iron lasted. Every hinge, sword, or chain carried a little piece of its maker's madness, the kind that can't be replicated by automated rollers or quality control spreadsheets. When you hold a piece of medieval iron, you're holding something that remembers being born in fire and violence, and somehow came out patient. Your modern wrench, on the other hand, was born in a factory, raised by robots, and will die of moisture exposure before the next tax season. To the medieval blacksmith, iron wasn't just a resource. It was a living thing that needed persuasion. They believed every bar had a temperament, a will, even a mood. Some iron wanted to be a sword. Some only ever agreed to be a horseshoe. You didn't just forge it, you negotiated with it. Modern engineers would call that superstition. Medieval smiths called it Tuesday. They worked with fire, not formulas. Their measurements were a handful, a while, and when it feels right. They could tell temperature by color, carbon content by the sound of a strike, and quality by how the sparks danced in the dark. It wasn't precision, it was intuition, a kind of spiritual metallurgy that came with burns, calluses, and a permanent cough. And yet, this philosophy worked better than most of our industrial logic today. The blacksmith's goal wasn't efficiency, it was endurance. He didn't care how fast he could make 10 nails. He cared that each one would last long enough to hold a door through 5 generations, and possibly an invasion. They treated iron as if it had memory, which, chemically speaking, it sort of does. The constant reheating and hammering created grain structures that remembered their shape, making them harder to corrode or crack. Each piece was unique, a conversation between man and material. It's hard not to admire that they weren't just building, they were bonding. Every swing of the hammer was a dialogue, part punishment, part prayer. By the time a sword or gate left the forge, it wasn't just forged metal, it was tempered emotion. Today, we build things by algorithm and blueprint, perfectly measured, perfectly lifeless. If a product fails, it's within tolerance. If medieval iron failed, it was personal. A bad hinge was an insult to your ancestors. The smith didn't retire his tools when he got old. He became one with them. His hammer handle smoothed where his sweat had soaked in. His anvil wore grooves from decades of blows. When he died, people said, "The forge has gone cold." Modern factories don't go cold. They just shut down for maintenance, which somehow feels less poetic and a lot less durable. Medieval blacksmiths may not have known chemistry, but they understood one universal law. If you leave iron alone for long enough, nature will eat it. So they didn't leave it alone. In fact, medieval maintenance routines bordered on obsessive. Every sword, hinge, and gate was constantly rubbed, oiled, and polished, like a beloved pet that could also kill you. Unlike us, they didn't wait until things started creaking. They cleaned their iron the way monks copied scripture, daily, reverently, and with quiet fear of eternal damnation if they messed up. Knights kept their armor spotless, not because of fashion, but because rust was armor's version of leprosy. A single orange spot meant shame, ridicule, and possibly tetanus. To fight it, they used tallow, beeswax, linseed oil, and occasionally animal fat from last night's dinner. Picture this: a fully armored knight standing by the fire, rubbing pork grease into his breastplate while debating theology. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. The fat sealed out moisture, the soot added protection, and the smell kept most peasants at a respectful distance. For larger structures, gates, fences, and church hardware, blacksmiths used tar and pitch. These sticky black coatings weren't just waterproof, they were nearly indestructible. Some cathedral hinges still bear traces of them today, like ancient fingerprints of paranoia. Modern people, meanwhile, treat rust as an aesthetic problem. It gives it character, they say, as their garden furniture crumbles into iron flakes. Medieval people didn't romanticize decay, they declared war on it. They also had a cultural advantage. They didn't own 200 disposable things made of cheap steel. They had one sword, one plow, one cauldron, and they maintained them like family heirlooms. In an era when everything you own could be melted down and reused, maintenance wasn't optional, it was moral. A rusted sword was an insult to its maker. A rusty gate was an offense to God's craftsmanship. They didn't just preserve metal, they preserved meaning. So the next time you see a medieval artifact in a museum, remember it's not just there because it was well made. It's there because someone 800 years ago took the time to rub sheep fat on it every week like their soul depended on it. And in a way, it probably did. If modern steel has one great flaw, it's that it was designed by people in a hurry. Everything about our metal screams, we have a deadline. Medieval iron, on the other hand, was the slowest thing ever made that wasn't a cathedral. It took days to smelt, hours to hammer, and entire seasons to finish a gate. Iron back then wasn't just a material. It was a time investment that could ruin your sleep schedule and save your soul. The bloomery, that ancient furnace of chaos, didn't rush. It burned slowly, unevenly, and inefficiently, just the way the metal liked it. Each batch had its own personality, depending on the ore, the charcoal, and how many bad decisions the apprentice made that day. If modern production is a sprint, medieval ironwork was a pilgrimage. And that's the thing, time changed the iron. The longer it sat in the forge, the more the impurities mixed and the carbon seeped in. Each reheating, each hammer strike aged the metal into stability. It wasn't chemistry, as much as patience disguised as physics. Today, steel is made in minutes. Factories melt, refine, and roll it in one continuous process, perfect for mass production, terrible for endurance. It's like comparing a home-cooked stew to instant noodles. One nourishes you for a lifetime, the other dissolves before you're halfway done eating. Medieval blacksmiths also let their iron rest. Literally. After forging, the metal would cool in the air, a polite way of saying, "We're tired and it's dark." But that cooling allowed the structure to settle naturally, forming grains and stress patterns that gave the metal flexibility. When a sword hit armor, it bent instead of shattering. When a gate weathered a storm, it flexed instead of cracking. They didn't have thermometers or metallurgical microscopes, but they understood rhythm, the tempo of iron. You worked with it, not against it. Our modern age loves shortcuts, faster production, thinner coatings, cheaper alloys. But every shortcut comes with a timer. The medieval blacksmith didn't build for speed, he built for eternity. So yes, your shovel rusts in 2 years, because it was born in a world that no longer believes in time. Their iron survived centuries because it was forged in one that did. By the time the Industrial Revolution rolled in, humanity decided that handcraft was overrated. The age of soot, steam, and spreadsheets had arrived, and with it, the slow death of indestructible iron. What had once been a sacred act of forging became a factory process, powered by profit margins, not hammers. The result: faster, cheaper, shinier metal that rusts like wet bread. Factories replaced blacksmiths, and the blast furnace replaced the bloomery. It could burn hotter, melt faster, and refine iron to near purity, which sounds like a good thing until you realize that pure iron rusts faster than a moral politician. By purging out the phosphorus, slag, and carbon that medieval smiths had accidentally left in, we also purged out the very chemistry that made their iron last for centuries. In the old days, every bar of metal had character, streaks, layers, imperfections that protected it. Now, industrial steel came out identical, predictable, and depressingly mortal. It was the metallurgical equivalent of processed cheese. Smooth, cheap, and guaranteed to go bad faster than you expected. The new world didn't have time to care. Steam engines, ships, and railways demanded tons of metal, not longevity. If something broke, you didn't fix it, you replaced it. The blacksmith's art of patience was traded for production schedules and quality control charts. The forges that once glowed red with craft now glowed white-hot with deadlines. And the irony: the refined iron that fueled the Industrial Revolution literally corroded the machines that made it. Railway bridges had to be repainted constantly. Ships rusted faster than they sailed. Factories built to last a century were crumbling before the ink dried on their blueprints. The age of progress had officially declared war on itself, and nature was winning. The blacksmiths of the past had made metal that grew old with dignity. The factories of the future made metal that died young and shiny. Efficiency became the enemy of endurance. So, while the Industrial Revolution gave us locomotives, skyscrapers, and a sense of superiority, it also gave us the reason every car needs a tetanus shot after 3 winters. The medieval world may have been dirty and slow, but at least their iron didn't need rust-proof paint. Progress, it turns out, sometimes just means learning how to rot in style. Modern science hates inconsistency. If 2 things don't come out exactly the same, someone gets fired. But medieval iron thrived on inconsistency. It was born in chaos, forged by instinct, and made up of 1,000 tiny mistakes that somehow got along. Every bar of metal was unique, unpredictable, and beautifully unreliable. And that's exactly why it endured. When a medieval blacksmith pulled a bloom from the furnace, it wasn't perfect. It was a tangled mess of slag veins, carbon spots, and silica pockets, a geological smoothie. As he hammered it into shape, those imperfections didn't disappear, they rearranged. The metal became a mosaic of microstructures, hard in one spot, soft in another, dense here, porous there. It shouldn't have worked, but nature likes weird. Modern steel, on the other hand, is the overachiever of the periodic table. Pure, uniform, and emotionally fragile. It rusts evenly, cracks neatly, and fails exactly when predicted. It's great for engineering and terrible for immortality. Medieval iron didn't fail neatly. It limped along for centuries, defying logic, science, and your car's warranty. Those microimpurities, the slag, the carbon, the phosphorus, acted like a built-in defense system. If rust started creeping in, it would hit one of those barriers and stop. The corrosion slowed, then stalled. The iron didn't resist decay, it redirected it. It made peace with oxidation, like an old knight who learned to take a punch. Even the color of medieval iron told a story. It wasn't shiny or uniform. It had depth, dark streaks, subtle gloss, a quiet dignity. It looked alive. Modern metal, in contrast, gleams like a mirror right until it starts peeling like sunburn. There's a reason we still find medieval gates, tools, and swords intact after 800 years, while stainless steel appliances are shedding flakes in your kitchen after 5. We traded patience for polish, endurance for efficiency, and individuality for conformity. The blacksmith's forge was never about perfection. It was about survival. His goal wasn't to make flawless metal. It was to make forgiving metal. Something that could bend, scar, and keep going. The 20th century gave us many miracles: flight, electricity, and the ability to ruin good metal with marketing. Enter stainless steel, the material that promised immortality and delivered disappointment. We were told it would never rust, never stain, never fail. And like every too-good-to-be-true promise, it came with fine print, unless exposed to oxygen, water, or time. Stainless sounds eternal, like something Zeus himself would use for cutlery. In reality, it's a fragile diva. Sure, it resists rust in a laboratory. In your backyard, where humidity and pollution play tag, it doesn't stand a chance. That fridge handle or garden trowel. Give it 2 years and it'll look like it's auditioning for a historical reenactment. The secret of stainless steel lies in a thin, invisible layer of chromium oxide that forms on the surface, a passive film that stops rust. It's clever, yes, but also clingy. Scratch it, expose it to salt, or sneeze near it wrong and that film breaks down. Once it's gone, the metal corrodes faster than your willpower at a buffet. Medieval iron, meanwhile, didn't bother with invisible layers. It built its protection into its very structure: impurities, slag, and carbon that fought corrosion from within. No coating, no lies, just chemistry and stubbornness. Stainless was invented in 1913 by metallurgists chasing modern perfection. They wanted metal that looked clean and required no maintenance, because nothing says progress like getting lazy about upkeep. It worked, sort of. Stainless steel is perfect for scalpels, sinks, and shiny kitchen aesthetics. But compared to medieval iron, it's a high-maintenance celebrity with a skincare routine that costs millions. Here's the irony. The term stainless doesn't even mean won't stain. It means stains less. It's a linguistic sleight of hand, like calling a medieval dungeon ventilation optional. Medieval blacksmiths never called their work rust-proof. They knew it would age, darken, and change. And that was the point. Their iron didn't fight nature, it cooperated with it. Stainless steel tries to outsmart nature and ends up losing every rainy season. If you ever want to humble yourself, compare a medieval blacksmith's life work to your IKEA bookshelf. His creation still exists, yours wobbles. Somewhere between the 13th century and the age of same-day shipping, humanity forgot the difference between building something and manufacturing something. The medieval forge wasn't a workshop, it was a philosophy. Every spark, every strike of the hammer carried intention. The smith wasn't just shaping metal, he was testing his patience, his strength, and occasionally his sanity. His process was slow, messy, and terrifyingly loud, the metallic heartbeat of civilization itself. He worked with imperfections, because he lived in an imperfect world. He didn't see flaws as failures, but as part of the character of the material, something to be guided, not erased. When the metal resisted, he adjusted his rhythm. When it cracked, he folded it again. In a way, the forge was a mirror. If the smith lost focus or temper, the iron punished him. Modern metallurgy has forgotten this dance. We treat iron like a resource, not a relationship. Machines handle it now, efficiently, emotionlessly, rolling it, stamping it, packaging it. The result? Products that shine but never last. They're perfect until they're not, and then they're replaced. The medieval smith would have been horrified, not at the technology, but at the attitude. To him, crafting metal was an act of humility. You didn't conquer nature, you collaborated with it. The iron came from the earth, the fire from the forest, the air from your own breath. It was all part of a cycle, one that modern progress has proudly paved over. Even the blacksmith's tools reflected patience. His hammer wore down over decades. His anvil became smoother with age. He didn't throw them away. He adapted to their new form, the way his apprentices adapted to his temper. Nothing in his world was disposable. Today, we build things that outlive our attention span, but not our lifetime. The smith built things that outlived dynasties. So maybe the lesson isn't about metallurgy at all. It's about mindset. The blacksmith didn't strive for new. He strived for forever. And ironically, that's what he got. If the Middle Ages gave us one lasting miracle, it wasn't castles or cathedrals. It was iron that simply refused to die. Centuries later, it still hangs from church doors, anchors bridges, and guards tombs, quietly mocking every rusted car and crumbling skyscraper humanity has built since. Empires rose and fell, languages vanished. But that medieval iron is still there, still doing its job, probably rolling its molecular eyes at us. That durability wasn't luck, it was attitude. Medieval blacksmiths didn't build for the next quarter. They built for eternity. Every hinge and sword was a message to time itself. You can try, but you'll lose. They didn't outsource craftsmanship to machines or shave minutes off their process. Their forges ran on patience, sweat, and a mild disregard for efficiency. Meanwhile, we've mastered the art of disposable everything. Our tools rust before the warranty expires. Our skyscrapers need constant repainting, and our innovation mostly means making things thinner and weaker so we can buy them again next year. Progress apparently now comes in cycles of corrosion. What's left of medieval iron tells a different story. It was forged imperfectly, maintained obsessively, and respected religiously. It didn't just resist time, it collaborated with it. Every year, a thin film of oxide built upon itself, sealing the metal tighter, making it tougher. Medieval iron didn't fight decay, it aged into strength. There's something poetic about that. The cathedrals that hold it together have been struck by lightning, shelled by wars, rebuilt by faith. Yet their iron still clings to the stone, blackened and calm, as if quietly saying, "I told you so." It has seen kings crowned, nations fall, and entire industrial revolutions come and go. All while your car battery dies if you look at it wrong. The lesson isn't about metallurgy anymore. It's about how we treat the things we make. The blacksmith built for permanence because permanence meant pride. We build for convenience because convenience means profit. Their iron endures because it wasn't made to be replaced. Before dawn broke over the crooked roofs of medieval Europe, A faint rustle could already be heard in the gutters, the sound of 1,000 tiny claws. The rats were awake. They owned the night, swarming through the refuse of cities that stank of rot, smoke, and desperation. And somewhere in that darkness, another creature stirred, the rat catcher. A man neither noble nor entirely despised, trudging through the alleyways with a sack slung over his shoulder, a club in one hand, and a stick tipped with wire in the other. He wasn't a hero, but he was necessary. In an age when the plague moved unseen, riding on the backs of vermin, a rat catcher was the only one standing between survival and pestilence. He didn't wear armor, only layers of torn wool, stiff with filth and the stains of his trade. His boots, if he had them, were caked in the mud and offal of the streets. The smell of his work clung to him like a curse, a mix of death, smoke, and the sour scent of rat fat. When he passed, people would cross themselves or pull their cloaks tighter, not out of hatred, but superstition. Rats didn't fear much, but they feared him. He knew their habits, when they nested, where they ran, and what they craved. He could hear them even when others couldn't, that faint scratching beneath floorboards that foretold disease. He followed the sound like a bloodhound, crouching in silence before striking with unnerving precision. One crack of his stick, one twitching body, and a dozen others scattered into the dark. Yet the rat catcher's life was a gamble. One nick from a flea-ridden carcass could mean death within a week. His profession carried no honor, no protection, and no reward worth dying for. But hunger made a man inventive. The towns needed him, even if they pretended not to. Each morning, when merchants opened their shutters and saw fewer rats, they thanked God, but never the man responsible. By midday, he'd be gone again, disappearing into the next quarter of the city, chasing the scratching chorus beneath the filth, hunting the creatures that thrived where humans failed to clean. In a world rotting from within, he was both savior and scavenger. The medieval rat catcher's tools looked less like instruments of work and more like the relics of a madman. His kit was a patchwork of necessity and desperation, a sack of traps, a jar of foul-smelling bait, and a stick polished smooth by years of killing. Some carried smoke pots made of clay, filled with burning herbs or sulfur to choke rats from their hiding places. The smoke was thick and vile, and so was the job. A good rat catcher learned to breathe through his teeth, not his nose. In the countryside, rat catchers favored dogs, wirily half-starved terriers with scars across their muzzles and an appetite for squealing prey. Others used ferrets, small and vicious, sent slinking through barns and grain stores to flush out the vermin. But in the narrow alleys of London or Paris, it was mostly man against swarm. Wooden traps with iron jaws snapped shut in the darkness, and the sound, a sharp click followed by frantic squealing, was as familiar to the catcher as a priest's bell at Mass. Bait was the secret, a mix of dried fish, cheese rind, and anything pungent enough to carry a scent through filth. Some men swore by blood, others by sweet wine or rancid oil. The smell could turn a stomach, but to the rat it was irresistible. The catcher would scatter crumbs and sit motionless, waiting in the dark, his stick poised like a knight's lance. But every tool had a curse. The stick might splinter. The smoke might backfire and choke the user. The traps might catch more fingers than rats. And the fleas, always the fleas, invisible assassins jumping from the twitching bodies, carrying the seeds of the Black Death. The rat catcher's hands were covered in bites, his skin raw and scarred. Many carried a lingering cough, a rattle in the lungs that never went away. Still he worked because without his trade, Towns would starve and disease would spread unchecked. He wasn't chasing rats for glory. He was chasing rent money, bread, and survival. And as the church bells rang in the distance, he tightened the rope on his sack and moved to the next street, ready to face another swarm of teeth and fleas before sunset. For all his skill and risk, the medieval rat catcher's reward was pitiful. He was part of what might be called the filth economy, those forgotten tradesmen who kept cities alive while wading knee-deep in humanity's waste. Nightmen emptied cesspits, leech collectors trolled the swamps, and the rat catcher stalked through the alleys where no one else dared to tread. Without them, disease would have swallowed entire towns. Yet they were treated as unclean, tolerated, not respected. Payment was rarely in coins alone. A merchant might toss him a loaf of stale bread or a mug of watered ale for a day's work. Sometimes a housewife would pay him in scraps or old clothes, anything to keep the scratching in her walls from growing louder. On good weeks, he might earn enough to buy a place at the tavern table, sitting alone while others sat just far enough away not to catch the smell of smoke, death, and rat carcass on his hands. Still, there was opportunity in pestilence. In plague years, the demand for his services spiked. Fear made people generous. For a time, they'd pay almost anything to have their homes cleansed, though the cleansing often meant little more than the burning of a few nests and a prayer to Sin. Rock, patron of plague victims. Rat catchers thrived on fear. The more the city panicked, the more their trade boomed, but greed always followed. The same people who begged for help at the height of infection would haggle the price down once the smell of death began to fade. If the rat catcher complained, they'd accuse him of spreading disease himself, a walking curse, bringing vermin with him wherever he went. More than one unlucky catcher was beaten or chased from town when the rats returned. Still, the job never disappeared. Cities needed him, no matter how much they denied it. The rats were constant, eternal, gnawing through grain stores, burrowing into monasteries, even nesting beneath the floorboards of the wealthy. And so the rat catcher returned night after night, working for coppers and crumbs in a market that smelled of filth, fear, and human hypocrisy, where the poor man who saved lives couldn't even save his own. Every medieval rat catcher understood one truth: he was never truly in control. The rats were clever, too clever in fact. They learned fast, avoided traps, and bred faster than any man could kill. A single female could produce dozens of offspring in a month, and within weeks, a fresh swarm would replace the old. It was a losing war, fought with sticks and smoke, and the enemy always came back hungrier. To outsmart them, rat catchers studied their prey like scholars of vermin. They knew that rats preferred warmth, grain, and filth, and that they followed the scent of food through cracks and drains. In the dead of night, a good catcher could trace a colony just by smell, the faint odor of grease, waste, and fear. Some even swore they could hear the difference between black rats and brown rats in the dark. The black ones were smaller, faster, and far more dangerous, carrying the fleas that spread the plague. Cities became battlegrounds, not of swords but of survival. In grain stores, taverns, bakeries, and monasteries, the rats reigned supreme. The catcher moved like a shadow, torch in hand, smoke curling behind him. His presence was as much ritual as work, a blend of superstition, science, and sheer grit. Some said certain rat catchers could speak to the creatures, luring them out with chants or whistles. Others believed their smell alone, half human, half rot, drove the vermin into a frenzy. But the rats always fought back. They bit, clawed, and swarmed when cornered. Many a catcher bore scars on his arms and ankles, thin crescent marks where desperate teeth had broken skin. Some caught fevers days later and never rose again. Yet there was no quitting. To leave rats unchecked meant famine, disease, and ruin. So the battle continued, endless and unseen. Beneath the cobblestones, inside monastery cellars under market stalls, and through the rafters of manors, it raged on. The hunter became part of the city's immune system, unwanted but essential. Every rat killed was a small victory. Every night survived a miracle. And though no one thanked him, the rat catcher knew his grim purpose. He fought not for gold, but for a fragile, plague-ridden peace. When the Black Death swept through Europe, the rat catcher's grim trade became something close to prophecy. Towns that once mocked his smell now begged for his presence. Bells tolled for the dead, carts rolled through streets filled with corpses, and behind it all rats. Countless rats feasting and breeding. The catcher's work was no longer about keeping food safe. It was about keeping humanity alive. But even he was powerless against the invisible killer that clung to the fleas. The symptoms came fast: fever, swelling, blackened skin, and soon even the bravest catchers began to vanish. Some towns outlawed the trade entirely, claiming the rat catchers brought the plague rather than prevented it. Others treated them as holy men, capable of driving out death with their smoke and sticks. It was a time when superstition and desperation blurred into one. Rat catchers in plague years walked the streets like ghosts, wrapped in rags and drenched in vinegar. They stuffed herbs into their nostrils and muttered prayers to St. Sebastian, patron of plague sufferers. They burned nests by the dozen, using sulfur and pitch until the air turned thick with poison. Rats fled in every direction, down drains, across rooftops, even over corpses, and the catcher followed, relentless. For some, the job became a kind of madness. Surrounded by death and isolation, they began to believe the rats spoke, that the vermin carried not just disease, but messages from hell itself. Chroniclers of the time wrote of catchers who dreamed of black rivers of rats, of gnawing teeth whispering in the dark. Whether delirium or guilt, it haunted the men who survived. Yet without them, whole towns would have fallen faster. When the plague retreated, leaving streets empty and silent, the rat catcher remained, weary, half-mad, and poorer than ever. He had faced death daily, and still he had nothing to show but scars and the faint, lingering stench of smoke and ash. In the end, the plague years proved what few wanted to admit. Civilization was always one rat away from collapse. And the man most despised, the filthy catcher in the alley, was perhaps the only one who truly understood that truth. Every seasoned rat catcher had his secrets. The work wasn't just strength and luck. It was cunning, timing, and an understanding of fear. Rats, after all, were cleverer than most men gave them credit for. They remembered smells, recognized patterns, and could sense danger. To trap them, the catcher had to think like one. He learned to move quietly to read the signs: droppings near a flour sack, teeth marks on wood, the faint shuffle behind a wall. He'd sprinkle flour across a floor to see tiny footprints by morning, revealing where the creatures passed in the night. He'd bait traps, not with abundance but scarcity. A single piece of meat left untouched for days, until the rats grew bold enough to trust it. Patience was as vital as any weapon. Many catchers developed their own concoctions of bait. One swore by a mixture of blood and beer, another by burnt bread soaked in oil. There were whispered recipes for poisons, 2. Crushed herbs, deadly roots, and powders that worked slowly so the rats wouldn't associate the food with death. The church frowned on such craft, calling it witches' work, but no priest ever came to help when the rats overran a granary. In some towns, the most cunning catchers used music. They'd whistle or hum as they worked, believing the vibrations unsettled the vermin. Others carried charms or wore talismans carved from rat bones, convinced it kept them safe from disease. Whether superstition or coincidence, every catcher had his ritual before a hunt. He might spit 3 times before lighting his smoke pot, or cross himself twice when entering a cellar. The line between faith and habit blurred easily when your life depended on luck. And yet, despite the filth and danger, some men found pride in the craft. They display their kills at the town square, rows of limp tails nailed to a post like trophies. The crowd would grimace but still gather to count them, secretly grateful. It was proof that someone was fighting the hidden war beneath their feet. The rat catcher knew he'd never be honored in song or story. But when he emptied his traps and watched the vermin burn, he found satisfaction in silence. His victory wasn't applause. It was the brief, rare sound of a quiet street. No matter how vital his work, the medieval rat catcher lived as an outsider. Society needed him, but never wanted him close. He walked invisible lines between survival and stigma, accepted only when desperation forced open the city gates. Once the rats were gone, so was his welcome. Children threw pebbles and called him Rat Devil. Tavern keepers made him drink alone, if they let him in at all. Priests frowned when he entered church, as though sin clung to his coat. Even beggars shied away, not out of pride but fear. The rat catcher reeked of smoke, sweat, and rot. He was a reminder of everything the townsfolk pretended didn't exist. Still, he knew things others didn't. He knew the secret paths beneath the city, where water and waste met. He knew whose cellars were clean, whose grain was rotting, whose homes echoed with scratching in the walls. Knowledge like that carried power, the kind that made mayors whisper and merchants pay under the table. Some catchers used that leverage wisely. Others became extortionists, releasing a few captured rats to remind a miserly client of his need for service. And then there were the whispers. People claimed rat catchers consorted with witches, that they brewed potions from rat bones or summoned swarms to curse their enemies. A few leaned into the myth, donning black cloaks or carrying carved staffs to terrify those who mocked them. Fear was as good as payment. Despite the insults, some townsfolk grew oddly fond of their local catcher. He was the man who braved sewers no one else would enter, who risked plague for pennies, who turned filth into safety. When plague returned or famine struck, they sought him out again, the same man they'd spat at a week before. But fame in his world was a curse. The moment peace returned, he was forgotten once more. A necessary evil stored away until the next crisis. And so he roamed from town to town, nameless, friendless, yet indispensable. The rat catcher had no parish, no home, and no legacy. He was the city's shadow, tolerated only as long as the scratching in the dark didn't stop. For a people ruled by faith and fear, the rat catcher existed at the edge of both. His trade was half craft, half curse, a strange dance with the creatures everyone despised. In the medieval imagination, rats weren't just pests. They were symbols of sin, gluttony, and the devil's handiwork. To catch them was to battle evil itself, but to live among them. That was another story entirely. Villagers whispered that rat catchers consorted with demons. How else could one man control such a plague of creatures? Some said they made pacts, exchanging their souls for dominion over vermin. Others believed they carried charms made from rat tails or bones soaked in blood and blessed under the new moon. A few even wore necklaces strung with the teeth of their prey, claiming it kept them safe from disease. It rarely did. Church records from England and Germany mention rat catchers accused of witchcraft. Their smoke pots, filled with sulfur and herbs, looked suspiciously like cauldrons. Their muttered curses sounded like spells. And when plague returned after a cleansing, villagers turned on them, shouting that the catchers had called the rats back to punish the ungrateful. Some were run out of town. Others vanished into the woods, never to be seen again. Still, superstition was a double-edged sword. Fear brought respect, or at least hesitation. A good rat catcher could weaponize that fear. He'd arrive in a dark cloak, face half covered, speaking in low tones. He'd let the townsfolk wonder if he was man or something else entirely. If they feared him, they'd pay more quickly and question him less. In the cities, where rats and people were equally uncountable, the rat catcher's strange aura became part of the urban legend. Mothers warned children that if they didn't wash or pray, the ratman would come in the night and carry them off in his sack. He was the boogeyman, and the savior rolled into one, both cleansing the world and reminding it how dirty it truly was. By candlelight, even he wasn't sure which role was true anymore. When he looked at the rat's gleaming eyes in the dark, he sometimes wondered who was really hunting whom. By the late Middle Ages, the rat catcher's world began to change. Towns grew larger, streets busier, and walls higher. But the rats stayed. They adapted faster than any human reform. As sanitation slowly improved and city laws forbade the dumping of waste into streets, the catcher found fewer places to work and fewer people willing to pay. The trade that had once kept him alive was now vanishing into memory. He still wandered, sacks slung over his back, smoke pot in hand, following rumors of infestations from one crumbling village to the next. Children no longer threw stones. They stared instead, curious at the relic of another age. He was a walking ghost of the time before hygiene, before sewers and soap. In some towns, his arrival caused more fascination than fear. He'd tell stories of the plague years, of rats as large as cats, of nights when scratching echoed through every wall. Few believed him, but they listened anyway. Some rat catchers took apprentices, passing down their grim wisdom: how to track by smell, how to kill without touching, how to know when a rat was clever enough to wait out a trap. But most died without legacy, their names forgotten, their bones buried outside city walls. No tombstones marked their resting place, only the absence of scratching beneath the floorboards. By the dawn of the Renaissance, the rat catcher had become folklore. In German towns, stories spread of the Rattenfänger, the Pied Piper, a mysterious figure who led both rats and children away with music. Historians would later say the tale was based on a real man, perhaps a rat catcher who vanished after a job gone wrong. Myth had swallowed history whole. In truth, the rat catcher's spirit never disappeared. He lived on in every pest control man who crawled into an attic, every laborer who faced filth to keep others safe. The tools changed. Smoke became chemical. Stick became steel. But the purpose remained the same: to fight the dark things that thrive when humans grow careless. And somewhere in the quiet of an old European cellar, the scratching still begins at night, a faint reminder that the rat catcher's work is never truly done. Before the fire brigade, before alarms or hydrants or buckets neatly lined in rows, there were men on towers, the fire watchers. From dawn until the deep hours of the night, their eyes swept across the wooden skeletons of medieval cities, searching for the first whisper of smoke. Every thatched roof, every chimney, every flickering torch below them was a possible disaster waiting to ignite. In an age when a single spark could erase an entire quarter, these men were the sentinels of survival. They climbed narrow spiral staircases that coiled through stone bell towers and church spires, emerging into freezing wind. From there, they commanded a view of the world, rooftops stretching like tinder beneath them, markets bustling with smoke from 1,000 hearths. Theirs was a lonely post, but it was sacred. They were the city's eyes, watching when everyone else slept. The danger wasn't just the flames. It was complacency. Medieval towns were packed tight, houses leaning toward each other like drunks, alleys barely wide enough for a man to pass through. Roofs were straw, beams were oak, walls were dry. One overturned candle, one kitchen fire, and the blaze would leap across the street before the church bells could toll. The fire watcher's entire duty depended on seconds, to spot smoke before it became a monster. Up there, they learned to read smoke like scripture. White smoke meant a hearth. Dark smoke meant trouble. They could tell if it came from wet timber, oil, or pitch. On stormy nights, when lightning struck too close, they stood ready, gripping ropes that hung from the bell above them. One pull, and the city would awaken to chaos. For their service, most earned little more than a handful of coins and a cot near the tower's base. Yet their work carried the weight of thousands of lives. When dawn broke and the sun painted the rooftops gold, they remained at their post, squinting through haze and chimney dust, praying the day would end as it began, quietly. Because if they missed a single wisp of smoke, by evening there would be nothing left to watch, only ashes and the echo of the bell that rang too late. The medieval fire watcher's world revolved around height. His tower was both fortress and prison, a lonely perch of stone rising above the maze of rooftops. Some towers were built for defense, others for bells or pride. But all served a second, humbler purpose: vigilance. Cities like Paris, Cologne, and Florence stationed men atop their tallest structures where they could see miles in every direction. From that vantage point, a fire was no longer a small domestic accident. It was a storm cloud made of smoke and ruin. The towers themselves varied wildly. In some towns, the fire watcher climbed the church steeple, squeezing up twisting staircases slick with damp stone. In other, he stood upon city walls or on crude wooden scaffolds hastily built for the job. The higher the tower, the safer the city, but the lonelier the man. He might spend 12 hours or more in silence, accompanied only by the wind and the tolling of bells below. The gear was minimal: a spyglass if he was lucky, a horn or bell rope, a lantern, and a wool cloak to fight the cold. Many cities forbade the use of fire at the watch post. The irony wasn't lost on them, so a brazier was a rare luxury. He ate bread hardened by the wind, drank from a flask, and watched. Always watched. His entire existence depended on his eyes not failing. Each tower had its own routine. Every hour the watcher was required to signal that all was well. In some places, a bell would ring once at midnight, a soft reassurance that the city still stood. If he failed to ring it, panic could sweep the streets below. And when smoke did rise, there was no room for hesitation. The bells were rung in a frantic rhythm, the alarm echoing through stone and wood. Within moments, the entire city would know fire had come. When dawn arrived, another man climbed the tower to relieve him. Their exchange was brief, a few words about the weather, the wind, and any suspicious hearths. Then one descended, stiff and half frozen, while the other took his place among the clouds, inheriting both the view and the burden of keeping an entire city from burning. To live in a medieval city was to live with fire and the fear of it. Every home had a hearth, every workshop a forge, and every night the streets glowed faintly from candles burning behind shuttered windows. People needed flame to live, but flame didn't care for boundaries. It crept from roof to roof faster than a man could run, devouring beams, cloth, and flesh alike. The fire watcher knew this better than anyone. His eyes never rested because the enemy never slept. The threat was everywhere. Bakers began work before dawn, their ovens blazing. Blacksmiths hammered iron through the night. Taverns lit torches that guttered in the wind. Even the churches were not safe. Their tall wooden spires made perfect kindling. Cities like London, Lubeck, and Bruges burned again and again across the centuries, each time rebuilt with the same flammable optimism, and each time the fire watchers stood helpless, as wind carried the inferno faster than bells could ring. They developed a sixth sense for disaster, a wisp of smoke that lingered too long, the sharp tang of pitch carried on the breeze, the faint orange shimmer against the night sky that didn't belong to any hearth. One shout from a tower, one frantic bell, and the city would explode into chaos. People rushing with buckets, monks chanting prayers, guards shouting for order that never came. For the watchman, failure was not an option. If he saw the smoke too late, he might not survive the morning. Townsfolk, blinded by rage and grief, often blamed the fire watcher for their losses. Where were your eyes? They would demand as the ashes cooled. Some were beaten. A few even executed for negligence. Watching wasn't just duty, it was survival. So every night they climbed higher, hearts pounding, whispering small prayers to saints who had likely grown tired of hearing them. Lightning storms were the worst. A single strike on a thatched roof could undo months of vigilance. When the thunder rolled, they braced for screams. From their lonely towers, they saw not the beauty of the medieval city, but its fragility. A world one spark away from ruin. And when dawn's pale light returned, it was victory simply to see rooftops still standing. When fire finally came, it never whispered. It roared. The moment a fire watcher spotted smoke, the still night turned into panic incarnate. His first move was instinctive. Grab the bell rope and pull with all his strength. The sound tore through the silence, booming across rooftops, echoing down narrow alleys and shaking half the city awake. One bell meant danger, two meant disaster. And when the bells rang without pause, everyone knew the city was burning. The reaction below was instant chaos. Households burst into motion. Men grabbing buckets, women carrying children, apprentices rushing to wells or rivers. Fire carts didn't yet exist, so people formed human chains, passing water hand to hand, most of it spilling before reaching the flames. Guards tried to maintain order, shouting over the crackle and roar, but fear moved faster than reason. For the fire watcher, the bell was only the beginning. He had to stay on the tower even as the wind changed, and smoke rose to choke him. From above, he became the city's desperate guide, ringing in rhythm to direct the bucket lines, faster for north, slower for south. In the dark, the people listened, trusting his unseen eyes. He could see where the fire leapt from roof to roof, where the wind pushed sparks toward the market square or the cathedral. His heartbeat matched the bells, steady and furious. Below, the streets glowed red, buckets splashed, beams collapsed, and people screamed names into the smoke. Horses broke free, dogs howled, and sparks rained from the heavens like falling stars. Sometimes the fire spread so fast that entire quarters vanished before dawn. The watchtower itself might become a pyre, trapping its keeper inside. Many fire watchers died that way, refusing to abandon their post until the flames reached their feet. When dawn came and the smoke thinned, what remained was silence and ash. Streets once bustling with merchants and laughter were now blackened bones of timber and stone. The air stank of pitch and grief. The fire watcher, if he survived, would stand over the ruins of his city, bell rope still in hand, wondering if he could have rung sooner, shouted louder, seen faster. For him, every sunrise was both victory and guilt. When the city slept, the fire watchers truly began their work. Night was the most dangerous time, when candles burned low, drunks stumbled home with torches, and every shuttered window hid a potential spark. The fire watcher, high above it all, could see the glow of every hearth like stars scattered across the earth. From his perch he listened. The faint hum of the river, the distant sound of carts, and occasionally that dreaded crackle of something burning where it shouldn't. The shift began at sunset. 2 or 3 men might share the duty, taking turns through the long hours. They wrapped themselves in heavy cloaks against the wind and frost, their lanterns shaded so as not to blind their eyes. On clear nights, the horizon stretched endlessly, but fog and smoke often blurred everything into a sea of gray. The fire watcher had to trust instinct, a different shade of shadow, a flicker where there shouldn't be one. Some towers had signal fires ready, small braziers they could light to warn other watchtowers across the city. In places like Lübeck and Nuremberg, entire networks of towers communicated this way, passing the alarm faster than any runner could. The sound of one bell would trigger another, until the whole skyline trembled with metallic terror. But between alarms, the watch was quiet, hauntingly so. The city below was still, broken only by the occasional barking dog or a drunkard's song echoing through the alleys. Fire watchers grew used to solitude. Some sang softly to keep awake. Others carved tally marks into the wooden beam to count their shifts. Many grew superstitious, whispering to saints or muttering charms to blind the devil's flame. They saw things others never did, meteors flashing across the night sky, thieves scaling rooftops, lovers sneaking through courtyards, and sometimes strange lights moving beyond the city walls. But nothing frightened them like silence after a storm. It meant lightning had struck somewhere unseen. They would lean over the parapet, scanning every chimney and roof line, breath held, waiting for the faintest wisp of smoke. For the fire watcher, night was both enemy and companion, a veil that hid danger and yet made him feel alive. Up there, with the wind howling through the tower stones, he was the thin thread between peace and catastrophe. Medieval cities didn't rely on hope alone to prevent fires. They relied on fear. Laws were strict, punishments brutal, and the fire watchers stood at the center of this uneasy system. City councils issued endless decrees: no open flames after curfew, no forges without supervision, no baking at night, no candles near hay or straw. In theory, these laws made sense. In practice, they made everyone nervous, especially when a single mistake could lead to public humiliation or worse. If a blaze broke out, The fire watcher's first duty was to identify where it began. Once the flames were under control, if they ever were, officials would question the residents of that home. Bakers, chandlers, and smiths were often the first suspects. Many were fined, some imprisoned. A few unlucky souls were executed if the fire caused deaths. Even a child knocking over a candle could damn an entire family. Watchers themselves were held to impossible standards. Missing a fire or ringing the alarm too late could mean dismissal, flogging, or worse. Some were accused of sleeping on duty, the gravest sin imaginable. In certain towns, a negligent watchman would be forced to stand publicly beside the ruins, a bell around his neck, while townsfolk cursed and spat at him. It was justice by humiliation, a warning to the next man who thought to close his eyes. Cities also kept fire wardens who roamed the streets after dark, checking chimneys and enforcing curfews. The fire watchers coordinated with them from above, shouting warnings or tossing small stones to catch their attention when smoke rose where it shouldn't. Together, they formed an uneasy alliance between vigilance and paranoia, the city's immune system against its own carelessness. But fear had its limits. The laws were written by nobles who lived in stone manors, not wooden houses. The poor couldn't afford safer building materials or multiple hearths, so they risked the flames nightly. The fire watcher understood this better than anyone. He saw the same slums burn again and again, the same families lose everything, while officials blamed sinful negligence. To the city fathers, fire was a moral failing. To the fire watcher, it was just reality, the price of warmth in a world built entirely out of things that burned. When the bells rang and the sky glowed red, there were no engines, hoses, or uniforms, only people. Medieval firefighters were not professionals, but whoever could be roused in time. The fire watcher's alarm was their battle cry. Bakers, smiths, monks, and guards would drop everything to join the fight. Armed with nothing more than leather buckets, wet blankets, and blind courage, every city had its crude fire plan. Wells and water barrels were scattered through the streets, and men formed chains, passing buckets from hand to hand in frantic rhythm. The water rarely reached its target intact. Most spilled onto cobblestones or into open mouths, gasping for air. Others used sand or vinegar, anything that might smother the flames. Hooks and long poles were used to tear down burning roofs, sacrificing houses to save the block. It was chaos disguised as coordination. The fire watcher remained above the inferno, still ringing, shouting directions to those below. He was their eyes in the smoke, calling out which streets burned worst, or where the fire jumped the river. Sometimes his voice was lost in the roar, and the people worked by instinct alone, fighting not to save the city but themselves. There were no rewards for bravery, only scars. Men collapsed from smoke. Women fainted from exhaustion, and entire families joined the effort to save their homes. Priests walked among them, holding up crosses against the fire, sprinkling holy water that hissed uselessly on the coals. It was as much a spiritual battle as a physical one. A war between light and darkness, sin and survival. When the fire finally died, the survivors sat amid the wreckage, faces blackened with soot, hands blistered. The fire watcher descended from his tower, eyes red, lungs aching, too tired to speak. He would walk the ruins in silence, counting the cost of what he had seen from above. Streets where children had played that morning, now reduced to gray dust. No medals awaited them. No songs were sung. By dawn, they'd begin again, rebuilding with the same flammable timber and straw, knowing another fire would come someday. But when it did, the bells would ring again, and flesh and bone firefighters would rise from the ashes once more. To be a fire watcher was to live half a life, always awake, always waiting, never truly at peace. The city below might celebrate festivals, hold markets, and sing songs, but high above it all, the watcher stood apart. His world was wind and stone, smoke and silence. Even when no fire burned, he carried the memory of flames in his mind, the heat that seared, the screams that echoed, the smell that never truly washed away. The job demanded endurance. Nights on the tower were freezing in winter, sweltering in summer. Rain soaked through cloaks, wind howled through cracks, and frost turned rope stiff as bone. Sleep came in stolen minutes, and meals were often cold bread eaten with numb fingers. Many watchers grew sick from the exposure, lungs burned by smoke, joints twisted by damp air, eyes strained from endless squinting into the horizon. Few lived to old age, and yet they endured partly from duty, partly from necessity. Most were poor men hired for meager pay, because no one else wanted the post. But there was pride in it too, a grim satisfaction in knowing that their vigilance kept the city breathing. The people below might never thank them, but they relied on them completely. Each safe night was a silent victory. Still, the loneliness gnawed. Fire watchers were often seen as strange, touched by the solitude. Some turned to drink, others to prayer. A few spoke of seeing things that weren't there. Phantom fires, ghostly figures walking rooftops, the faces of those they'd failed to save flickering in the smoke. It was an occupation haunted by its own purpose. The irony wasn't lost on them. They were guardians of life, yet lived as if already forgotten. Their towers became tombs of vigilance, their names unrecorded. When one died, another simply took his place. No ceremony, no farewell, just another man climbing the same steps, gripping the same rope, staring into the same endless sky. And still they watched, because the moment they stopped, the city would fall asleep. And sleep in a wooden city was dangerous. For the fire watcher knew what others refused to admit. Civilization was only ever one careless flame away from oblivion. When the worst had passed, and the smoke thinned into morning mist, the fire watcher would descend from his tower like a ghost returning to the earth. The streets below, once alive with laughter and trade, were now graveyards of blackened timber and smoldering stone. The air carried a heavy silence, that peculiar stillness that follows disaster, when even birds seem afraid to sing. He would walk through what was left, his boots crunching on ash and broken glass. Children clung to their mothers, staring wide-eyed at the ruins that had been home. Bakers wept over scorched ovens. Merchants sifted through charred coins that no longer gleamed. The fire watcher said little. His throat burned from shouting, his eyes from smoke. People would look at him with a mix of awe and accusation. The man who saw it first, the one who rang the bell but not soon enough. It was never soon enough. In many cities, the day after the fire began with prayer. Church bells tolled not for alarm, but for mourning. Priests led processions through the ruins, sprinkling holy water on the ashes as if to baptize them into memory. Officials tallied the dead and drafted new fire ordinances, promising once again that this would never happen again. It always did. The fire watcher often returned to his tower by sunset. Repairs began below, but his duty resumed immediately because embers still glowed under beams, and the wind still carried the scent of danger. He would climb again, step after aching step, to the same perch where he had watched the city burn. From there he would see smoke still rising in thin, ghostly trails, and perhaps for a brief moment believe it was all starting over. But when the sun set, the rooftops turned gold once more. Children played amid the ruins. The city's pulse began to return, and high above, the fire watcher stood silently against the fading light, his bell at rest, his eyes tired but unblinking. He knew that peace was an illusion, a fragile reprieve granted by mercy, not mastery. For the medieval city was a candle in the dark, and he its trembling flame, flickering, vigilant, and forever one breath away from being snuffed out. By day, Dodge City looked like any frontier settlement. Dusty streets, clapboard saloons, horses tied to rails, and a courthouse trying its best to look respectable. But when the sun sank below the Kansas plains, the city changed its face. Lanterns flickered to life, piano keys clanged through open windows, and the faint perfume of whiskey, sweat, and sin drifted through the air. This was the other Dodge, the one the preachers warned about and the cowboys dreamed of on the trail. Along the infamous south side of Front Street, where the gas lamps burned dim, stood the red light district, a place where pleasure and survival danced hand in hand. Brothels, saloons, and gambling dens lined the muddy road, each doorway glowing crimson from the soft oil lamps hung above them. Inside, men laughed too loudly and drank too hard, hopping to drown the ghosts that followed them west. The women of Dodge were called many names: soiled doves, painted ladies, scarlet angels. Society spat the words like curses, but behind the sneers lay dependence. Without them, Dodge's economy would have collapsed. These women kept the money flowing when the cattle drive stopped. They bought food, paid rent, and spent what cowboys earned faster than the saloon keepers could pour another drink. Many of them came from hard luck, widows, runaways, or women simply too poor to survive any other way. They were as much a part of Dodge's frontier fabric as the gunslingers and gamblers. Some worked in small cribs, one-room shacks lit by lanterns, while others earned their keep in the grander parlor houses where lace curtains and piano music tried to disguise the trade. Marshal Bat Masterson and Sheriff Wyatt Earp could keep order in the streets, but even they knew better than to stir too deeply into the red light maze. The town's vices were too profitable, too essential. Everyone, from the barkeep to the banker, benefited from what went on behind those closed, lamplit doors. When the night wind blew across the plains, carrying the sound of fiddles and laughter, Dodge City pulsed like a living thing, wild, dangerous, and beautiful. In that district of flickering red light, the frontier's heart beat fastest, where law ended and lust began. They were the backbone of Dodge City's night economy, the so-called soiled doves. Behind the lace curtains and the smoky glow of lanterns, these women turned desire into a business, their beauty a fleeting currency in a town that ran on hunger and gold. But to survive here meant more than charm. It required cunning, endurance, and a willingness to play a dangerous game in a city ruled by men with guns and tempers. Most of the women had come west chasing the same dream as the cowboys: freedom and fortune. Some were abandoned wives, others orphans or farmers' daughters who ran away from nowhere towns. A few had once worked as singers, waitresses, or seamstresses, before hardship drove them into the red light trade. Whatever their past, Dodge didn't ask questions. The moment they stepped into the district, they became part of its machinery, nameless, essential, and disposable. There were classes among them, too. The The lowest worked in cribs, tiny, bare rooms with a bed, a wash basin, and just enough space for business. These women earned little and aged fast. Those with luck or charm found places in the parlor houses, where the furniture was velvet, the whiskey finer, and the clientele wealthier. Here, the women were expected to sing, dance, and flirt as much as to entertain. Sophistication sold as much as skin. Some rose to fame within Dodge, becoming local legends. Big Nose Kate, companion of Doc Holliday, once worked the district before following him down the outlaw trail. Others, like French Mary and Squirrel-Tooth Alice, were as well known as any gunslinger. They were sharp-tongued, quick to laugh, and quicker to draw a knife if a client forgot his manners. But beneath the rouge and perfume was exhaustion. Disease, violence, and heartbreak claimed most before they reached 30. Respectable society refused to bury them within city limits, so the Boot Hill Cemetery filled with nameless graves marked only by wooden crosses. Still, the soiled doves kept the town alive. Their earnings paid the musicians, the bartenders, the shopkeepers, even the preachers who condemned them on Sundays. And when the cattle herds arrived each spring, the cowboys didn't head for church. They rode straight for the red lights of Dodge. In Dodge City, virtue might have been scarce, but business was booming. The red light district wasn't just a den of vice. It was an economic engine disguised in perfume and sawdust. Every coin that clinked across a bar or slipped beneath a petticoat found its way back into the town's veins. The saloon owners, gamblers, and even the lawmen all had a stake in the dance of money and sin. Cowboys were the lifeblood of it all. After months of driving cattle across endless plains, they arrived in Dodge half-mad with exhaustion and cash. The moment they were paid, their pockets burned. They hit Front Street in waves. First the saloons, then the gambling halls, and finally the brothels. Whiskey loosened tongues and morals alike, and by midnight the town pulsed with laughter, music, and the rattle of poker chips. The women knew the rhythm well. They were both temptation and therapist, listening to stories of lost herds, dead friends, and the ache of loneliness that only the plains could breed. For a few dollars, a cowboy could buy not just a body, but an illusion, warmth, affection, and the feeling that he wasn't completely forgotten by the world. Behind the glitter, though, the business was ruthless. Every bottle, every game, every visit was tallied and taxed. The brothel madams kept strict accounts, and the city officials quietly took their cut. Even the preachers benefited indirectly. Sin filled the collection, plates faster than sermons ever could. The women, of course, saw little of the profit. Most owed debts to their employers for clothing, rent, or fines, a clever way to keep them working, no matter how tired or sick they became. Still, money flowed like a river through the red light streets, and no one wanted to dam it. The district funded more than pleasure. It paid for Dodge's expansion, new buildings, paved roads, and law enforcement itself. The same men who condemned vice in daylight turned a blind eye at night, knowing exactly where their salaries came from. And so the cycle continued. Whiskey, music, and flesh feeding the city that pretended to despise them. Dodge's moral compass might have spun wildly, but its economy never lost direction. It pointed straight towards sin, and business was good. In Dodge City, the line between law and lawlessness was thinner than a lady's stocking. The same men who tamed gunfights on Front Street often spent their evenings in the company of the very women they were supposed to keep in check. Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, and Charlie Bassett, names now etched in legend, all patrolled the same streets where the red lamps burned brightest. They knew that peace in Dodge didn't come from shutting the district down. It came from keeping it just under control. The brothels operated with a silent understanding. Pay your fees, keep your girls from starting trouble, and the law would look the other way. Some madams even hired off-duty deputies as guards, ensuring both protection and cooperation. The arrangement suited everyone. The lawmen got their drink in comfort. The city got its revenue, and the women got just enough safety to survive another night. But things could turn ugly fast. Cowboys drunk on whiskey and pride often challenged the rules, picking fights with gamblers or worse, with the women themselves. That's when the peacekeepers earned their pay. A single pistol shot could end a brawl in seconds, the echo bouncing off the saloon walls while the piano player kept playing, pretending not to notice. For all their stern talk about order, even the lawmen weren't immune to the charms of the district. Many formed genuine relationships with the soiled doves, brief, passionate affairs that blurred the line between duty and desire. Wyatt Earp himself was known to keep company with women of the trade, a fact that didn't tarnish his legend nearly as much as his enemies hoped. In Dodge, everyone understood. Morals were flexible when the whiskey was good and the company better. The women, too, learned how to navigate the balance of power. A kind word to the right sheriff could make a fine disappear. A favor to a deputy could keep a rowdy cowboy out of her room. They wielded their influence not with guns but with wit, and it often proved deadlier. In the end, law and lust were partners in Dodge's dance. The marshals may have worn the badges, but when the lanterns glowed red, it was the women who truly ruled the night. If the soiled doves were the heartbeat of Dodge's red light district, the madams were its iron spine. They were women who had clawed their way out of the cribs and shacks, trading youth for power and poverty for influence. Behind every painted door and flickering lantern stood a woman who ran her house like a general commanding troops, stern, shrewd, and utterly unflinching. Madams like Dora Hand, Nellie Bessie Earp, and Miss Kitty Loy turned brothels into small empires. Dora, once a dance hall singer, became one of the most beloved women in Dodge, generous, elegant, and respected even by the toughest cowboys. Kitty, known for her temper and her pistol, could shoot and gamble as well as any man. She ran her parlor with velvet gloves and a revolver beneath them. These women dealt in pleasure, but demanded respect. Their word carried more weight than most mayors. Running a brothel required more than charm. A madam had to balance the books, keep her girls safe, and maintain peace with both the law and the church. She paid the police to inspect her establishment, bribed reporters to keep names out of the papers, and made quiet donations to the local orphanage, an act that soothed consciences on both sides of town. Inside the parlor houses, life was carefully staged. Red velvet curtains, polished brass lamps, and perfumed air masked the reality of the trade. Musicians played waltzes, gamblers dealt cards, and laughter filled the rooms. But behind the glamour was exhaustion. The madams kept strict schedules, girls worked in shifts, earnings were split, and debts tallied with precision. Anyone who broke rules faced fines or dismissal. Still, many women saw the madams as saviors. They offered food, protection, and a place to sleep, luxuries rare for women alone in the West. Under a madam's roof, a girl might at least live another year. And yet the life was fragile. A bad fire, a violent client, or one jealous rival could erase everything overnight. Still, the madams endured. They built empires from dust, carved respect from hypocrisy, and held their own in a world made for men. In Dodge City, they didn't just sell dreams, they owned them. When the cattle drives thundered into Dodge, the red light district braced for the storm. Hundreds of dusty, sunburned cowboys flooded the streets, pockets heavy with pay and minds hungry for escape. After months on the trail, eating beans and sleeping under stars, Dodge City was heaven, loud, bright, and sinful. The men had three priorities: whiskey, women, and winning a hand of poker before dawn. They came from Texas, Colorado, and the Dakota Plains, boys barely out of their teens, hardened by miles of dust and death. They rode into town whooping and hollering, spooking horses and frightening respectable folk who quickly locked their doors. By nightfall, they filled every saloon and brothel from Front Street to the outskirts. The piano players never stopped. Neither did the bottles. The cowboys spent their wages fast: $10 at the bar, $20 at the card table, and whatever was left behind the curtain doors upstairs. The soiled doves waited by the stairways in satin dresses and feathered hair, greeting them with practiced smiles and soft laughter. For a few brief hours, these men could forget the loneliness of the plains, the graves of their friends, the endless silence, the scent of cattle and sweat. Here there was perfume, warmth, and the illusion of affection. The nights were loud, sometimes violent. Fights erupted over cards, women, or spilled whiskey. Pistols flashed, chairs broke, and lawmen waited in swinging. But for most, it was a ritual, a release after months of discipline on the trail. The next morning, they'd be broke, hung over, and half in love with a woman whose name they'd already forgotten. Yet the cowboys and the soiled doves shared an unspoken bond. Both lived hard, short lives shaped by the frontier's brutality. They understood loss, endurance, and the need to live fast before fate caught up. When a cowboy died in a barroom brawl or a stampede, the women mourned him quietly. Some even followed the funeral processions to Boot Hill, standing apart, veiled as the dirt fell. By the time the next herd came through, the cycle began again. The same songs, the same faces, the same hunger. Dodge City lived and breathed through those nights. Its pulse measured not in law or order, but in the laughter of cowboys and the sighs of the women waiting upstairs. Dodge City's red light district thrived on pleasure, but it was built on danger. Behind every curtain of laughter and whiskey haze lurked the threat of violence, quick, brutal, and often senseless. Fights were as common as flirtations. A wrong glance, a crooked card, or a jealous outburst could turn a parlor into a battleground. For the women of the district, every smile carried risk. Every night, a calculation of survival. The saloons were pressure cookers of ego and liquor. Cowboys swaggered and armed. Gamblers carried hidden blades, and lawmen walked the line between keeping peace and losing patience. The women knew the drill: distract, diffuse, or disappear. A gentle hand on an arm might calm a drunk faster than any pistol. Still, when charm failed, knives were quick and tempers quicker. Some of the worst violence came not from strangers, but from those the women trusted: pimps, lovers, and even jealous madams. Rival houses sometimes fought over territory, sending hired thugs to slash lanterns, cut supply lines, or scare off clients. The sheriff's office tried to keep order, but often justice was bought in whiskey or favors. The women learned to fend for themselves. Many kept pistols under their pillows or razors in their garters. Disease added another layer of fear. The brothels carried the unspoken plague of the frontier: syphilis, consumption, and the slow-wasting illnesses that medicine couldn't cure. City doctors made good money treating the women, though they rarely treated them kindly. Churchmen preached repentance, but few offered charity. The women turned instead to each other, forming tight circles of loyalty and vengeance. When one girl was hurt, the others remembered, and revenge in Dodge was never slow. The fire patrols and marshals treated the district as both necessity and nuisance. They couldn't close it. The money was too good, but they kept one eye open. Patrols walked the alleys with lanterns, ready for trouble. Fights were broken up. Corpses dragged to the undertaker. And by dawn, the streets were scrubbed. The blood washed away. By sunrise, Dodge looked peaceful again. The lamps were out, the curtains drawn, and the city's respectable citizens stirred as if nothing had happened. But beneath that thin layer of civility, the embers of sin and violence smoldered, waiting for night to wake them again. For every coin spent in Dodge City's red light district, someone in town was praying for its damnation. The church bells rang as fiercely as the saloon pianos played, and the moral crusaders of the frontier made it their mission to clean up Dodge. Yet for all their sermons and public outrage, even the most righteous citizens knew, without sin, the city would starve. The newspapers printed pious condemnations in one column, and advertisements for whiskey and dance halls in the next. Ministers thundered from their pulpits about the wrath of God, while quietly accepting the donations of brothel madams who financed orphanages and church repairs. It was an open secret. The red light district paid for the town's salvation. Preachers and reformers often targeted the women, not the men. Fallen angels, they called them, urging repentance while ignoring the ranchers, lawmen, and businessmen who visited those same houses nightly. Some reform groups tried to close the brothels, claiming moral duty. But the city council hesitated. Too many pockets were lined with vice money. The mayors, the sheriffs, even the undertakers. Every dollar that passed through the red lamps eventually made its way into respectable hands. A few ministers took their war to the streets. They marched into the district with hymn books and fire in their eyes, calling the women to abandon sin and embrace the Lord. But the soiled doves knew better. For many, repentance meant starvation. There were no second chances for a woman with a past, only judgment. Some mocked the preachers. Others simply shut the door and went back to work. Ironically, the madams often did more for the poor than the churches did. They paid for medicine, funded burials, and took in orphaned children from the very men who had frequented their rooms. Their compassion was practical, not pious. An unholy charity that the town relied on, but refused to acknowledge. By day, Dodge City wore its Sunday face, the choir singing, the press preaching virtue. But when night fell, the lamps glowed red again, and the same moral guardians pretended not to hear the laughter echoing across the plains. Hypocrisy, like whiskey, flowed freely, and both kept Dodge running. By the late 1880s, Dodge City had begun to sober up. The wild cattle drives dwindled. The railroad brought families and merchants, and the once rowdy cow town started pretending to be civilized. The famous gunfighters moved on, Earp to Arizona, Masterson to Denver, and with them went the chaos that had defined the city's glory days. But as the gun smoke cleared, the red lights along Front Street began to dim. The city fathers, eager to attract respectable business, turned on the district that had built their fortunes. New laws banned prostitution inside city limits, though everyone knew the girls simply moved a few streets farther south. Saloons were forced to close earlier, gambling was restricted, and reformers celebrated what they called the cleansing of Dodge. Yet those who had lived through its wildest years understood the truth. The city's heart was being carved out in the name of respectability. Many of the women vanished as suddenly as they had appeared. Some followed the trail of sin westward to Denver or San Francisco. Others faded into anonymity, their names lost to the prairie wind. A few tried to start new lives, seamstresses, cooks, even wives. But the past clung to them like perfume. Dodge had used them, loved them, and forgotten them, all in the same breath. The brothels were torn down one by one, their red lanterns extinguished. The grandest of them, Dora Hand's parlor, burned to the ground not long after her death, as if the city itself wanted to erase the memory of its lustful youth. In their place rose churches, schools, and neat white homes, monuments to virtue built on foundations laid by vice. Yet the ghosts of the red light district never fully left. Travelers still whispered about the women who once ruled the night, their laughter echoing through time. The legends of Dodge's doves became part of the myth of the Old West, tragic, romantic, and half forgotten. By the time the electric lamps replaced oil lanterns, the glow of sin had faded into nostalgia. But for a few brief, blazing decades, Dodge City's red lights had burned brighter than any star over Kansas. And the women who lit them had kept the frontier's wild heart beating long after the gunfire stopped.